There is a name so hated that for 2,000 years, parents refused to give it to their children. A name that Dante placed at the very bottom of hell, deeper than murderers, deeper than tyrants, deeper than the devil himself. But here is the question that history has never fully answered. What if everything you were taught about this man is wrong? What if the greatest villain in the story of salvation was actually the only one trusted with its most impossible secret? What if the kiss in the garden was not a betrayal, but a request? Tonight, we are going back to the dusty roads of Roman-occupied Judea, back to the silver coins, the olive garden, and the field that still holds its silence 2,000 years later. This is not the story you learned in church. This is the story behind it. Stay with us. It will change the way you read everything. There is a name that has echoed through 2,000 years of history like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. A name spoken in whispers, written in condemnation, painted in shades of yellow and shadow. Before there was a cross, before there was an empty tomb, before there was a resurrection that shook the foundations of the ancient world, there was a choice. And the man who made that choice was not a monster. He was something far more dangerous. He was a believer. His name was Judas, and this is the story they never finished telling you. He came from the south. While the other 11 answered the call of a wandering rabbi from the banks of the Sea of Galilee, Judas Iscariot walked out of a different landscape entirely. Kerioth, a town carved into the dry limestone hills of Judea, south of Hebron, far from the fishing boats and the morning mist of the northern waters. The name itself, Ishkarioth, means simply man of the city. And that distinction mattered more than anyone cared to admit. The 12 were overwhelmingly Galilean, tradesmen, fishermen, men who smelled of brine and sawdust, men who spoke Aramaic with a northern accent that made Jerusalem aristocrats smirk. Judas was different. He was educated in the southern tradition, literate in a way that commanded a kind of quiet authority. He could read contracts. He understood commerce. He knew how the temple economy worked, how Roman taxation was structured, how money moved through an occupied city like blood through a diseased body. Jesus chose him knowing all of this. And according to the oldest whispers preserved at the edges of Scripture, he pulled Judas aside early, not to comfort him, not to give him a blessing, but to tell him something the others were not ready to hear. That some work requires a different kind of strength, that not every calling is crowned with applause. Judas touched the hem of his teacher's garment and felt not peace, but the weight of something coming, something enormous, something he could not yet name. The role fell to him naturally, perhaps inevitably, the glossocomon, the money bag, the common purse. While Simon Peter argued theology and John leaned his head against the chest of the teacher, Judas counted coins. He tracked provisions. He managed the logistics of a traveling ministry that, at its peak, moved dozens of people across the rocky terrain of Roman Palestine. The patronage network that sustained them was real and carefully maintained. Women of means, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, Susanna, provided financial support to the movement out of their own resources. This was not unusual. Traveling teachers and their disciples in first-century Judea depended almost entirely on such patronage. Judas was the one who received those gifts, who kept the records, who ensured the group could eat, could travel, could survive another week in the wilderness. But ledgers demand a certain kind of mind, and a mind trained on ledgers begins inevitably to ask the question that poetry and faith try so hard to silence: what is this actually worth? The desert of Judea is not a romantic place. It is brutal, bleached, and ancient beyond comprehension. It was in those cracked valleys, in the dry heat between one village and the next, that Judas began to encounter other men. Men with harder eyes, men whose cloaks concealed curved blades no longer than a forearm. The Sicarii, the dagger men, the tax burden under Pontius Pilate, was a wound that refused to close. Roman tribute drained the countryside, while the temple aristocracy collaborated with the occupiers to maintain their own comfort. The sicarii were the pressure valve, assassins and revolutionaries who believed that the only language Rome understood was blood. They had watched the miracles, they had heard the sermons, and they wanted to know, was this rabbi from Nazareth the weapon they had been waiting for? They pressed a dagger into Judas's hand, not as a command, as a question. Are you a disciple or are you a man? Judas stood at the edge of two worlds, and the ground beneath his feet was growing thinner by the day. It happened in Bethany, in the home of a man called Simon, 6 days before the Passover that would change the calendar of civilization. A woman named Mary, sister of Lazarus, the man Jesus had pulled breathing from a sealed tomb, entered the room carrying an alabaster jar. She broke the seal. The scent of spikenard filled the air like a prayer made visible. 300 denarii, that was the market value of the perfume she poured without hesitation over the feet and the head of her teacher. 300 denarii was a working man's annual wage. It was a number Judas did not have to calculate. It arrived in his mind instantly, automatically, the way a musician hears a wrong note before they can explain why. He spoke. The words came out dressed as righteousness. Could this not have been sold and given to the poor? But underneath the language of charity was something raw, something that recognized in that extravagant, irreversible act of worship that Mary of Bethany understood something about Jesus that Judas was only beginning to see. She was not celebrating a king about to conquer. She was anointing a body about to be buried. Jesus looked directly at him. Let her alone. 4 words, a public rebuke, quiet and surgical in front of the entire room. Judas felt it the way a man feels the first fracture in a bone. Not the sharp, obvious break, but the hairline crack that announces what is coming. Many had already left. After the discourse in Capernaum, the strange, hard teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, the outer rings of the movement had dissolved. Some walked away confused. Others walked away offended. Jesus had turned to the 12 and asked the question that hangs in the air like smoke, "Will you also go away?" Peter had answered for the group, but it was Judas who stayed silent longest, and Jesus, looking at the circle of faces he had chosen himself, said something that no one fully understood in the moment. One of you is a devil. The Greek word was diabolos, not a horned creature, but an accuser, a slanderer, one who operates in accusation. Judas heard it and felt, beneath the cold fear, something unexpected. Recognition. If the Messiah refused to raise an army, if he continued to speak in parables that the crowds couldn't decode and the priests wanted to prosecute, then what exactly was the plan? Judas needed an answer, and the question was hardening in him like clay in a kiln. The road to Jerusalem was paved with palm branches. The crowd was enormous, pilgrims flooding into the city from every corner of the ancient world for the feast of Passover, the city swelling from its usual 50,000 to nearly 200,000 souls crammed inside limestone walls. They screamed for a king. They threw their cloaks on the road. They waved branches cut from the palms of the Kidron Valley and shouted words that, in an occupied city, amounted to a declaration of war. Judas watched from the edge of the procession. His eyes moved not to Jesus, riding deliberately on the back of a young donkey, the precise fulfillment of a prophecy from Zechariah written 5 centuries before, but to the towers of the Antonia fortress that loomed over the northern wall of the Temple Mount. Roman eyes were up there, Roman soldiers with Roman swords and Roman orders to prevent at all costs a Passover riot. He had studied the geography. The Kidron Valley fell sharply on the eastern edge of the city, a natural choke point. The streets of Jerusalem during Passover were a tactical nightmare, crowded, narrow, volatile. The Romans knew it. The high priest knew it. And the man riding into the middle of all of it on a donkey, accepting the worship of a crowd that wanted him to be a conqueror, he knew it too. The palm branches caught the afternoon light and seemed for just a moment to Judas's fracturing mind, less like a welcome and more like a burial offering. The crowd was celebrating, he was calculating. And somewhere in the difference between those two responses, the clock had already begun to tick. The temple complex at night was a different world entirely. By day, it was theater, pilgrims, merchants, the endless percussion of commerce in the outer courts, the smell of sacrificial smoke rising in thick columns toward a sky that seemed, in those moments, genuinely attentive. But at night, when the crowds retreated to their tents and their rented rooms, the corridors of power revealed their true architecture: stone, shadow, calculation. Judas moved through it with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 3 years navigating the margins between worlds. He was not a worshipper tonight. He was a man with an appointment. The chamber of hewn stone sat embedded in the southern wall of the Temple Mount, the seat of the Sanhedrin, the 71-member Supreme Council of Jewish religious and civil law. Its floor was precisely half inside the sacred precincts and half outside, a deliberate architectural reminder that the court's authority touched both the holy and the civil without being entirely consumed by either. Caiaphas, the high priest, understood the geometry of power down to the last cubit. The Sanhedrin's fear was specific and well-founded. Passover was a festival that commemorated liberation from an empire. Every year, the memory of Egypt sharpened the edge of resentment toward Rome. Pontius Pilate had already demonstrated a particular talent for provocation. He had once brought military standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem, triggering a near riot that only ended when the crowd proved willing to die rather than submit. Another incident, another spark in the wrong moment, and Rome would not send diplomats. It would send legions. And everything the temple establishment had carefully preserved, their authority, their institution, their fragile arrangement with the occupying power, would burn with the rest. They needed Jesus contained, quietly. Before the feast day, crowds could organize around him. Judas sat across from men who wore their robes like armor and spoke in the measured cadences of people accustomed to deciding the fates of others. He made his case. He knew the teacher's movements. He knew his habits, his retreats, his preferred hours of solitude. He could deliver him to a garden at night, away from the crowd, without incident. And he told himself, perhaps for the first time, perhaps for the 100th, the story that made this possible to bear. That he was not destroying anything, that he was merely accelerating the inevitable. That the script had been written before the foundations of the world were laid, and he was simply the one with the courage to turn the page. The room went quiet. And then came the sound of counting. 30 pieces of silver. The number arrives in history with the weight of prophecy because it was prophecy. Zechariah had written it, strange and elliptical, centuries before the moment it was fulfilled. But its original legal meaning was coldly specific. 30 shekels of silver was the compensation prescribed in the law of Moses for a slave accidentally killed by someone's ox. It was not an insult exactly, but it was a price that communicated with perfect precision what the temple establishment thought of the disruption they were purchasing the elimination of. The currency itself mattered. The shekel of Tyre, a thick, high-purity silver coin bearing the image of the Phoenician god Melkart, was the only coinage the temple treasury accepted, despite the irony of a pagan face stamped on money used for sacred transactions. Its silver content was unimpeachable. Its weight was reliable. In the economy of the holy, only the most trustworthy currency would do. 30 coins. Judas felt their weight in his hands and experienced something he could not name, a sensation located precisely between confirmation and collapse. The upper room was warm with the smell of unleavened bread and lamp oil, and the close proximity of men who had traveled and argued and prayed together for 3 years. Judas took his place among them as he had done 100 times before. He ate. He listened. He watched Jesus move through the rituals of the Passover meal with the unhurried gravity of a man who knew exactly where the evening was going. Then came the moment that would be remembered and misunderstood in equal measure for 2 millennia. The sopiai, a piece of bread dipped into the common bowl, was, in the intimate language of Middle Eastern table fellowship, an act of profound personal regard. To offer the SOP to another guest was to honor them above the others present. It was not a casual gesture. It was the host saying, without words, "You are seen, you are known, you are valued." Jesus dipped the bread, and he gave it to Judas. The other disciples watching saw nothing unusual. Perhaps they assumed it was a mark of friendship. Perhaps they were too absorbed in their own conversations to pass the gesture. When Jesus leaned close to Judas and spoke, "What you do, do quickly," they assumed he was sending the treasurer on a late errand, buying provisions for the feast, making arrangements for the poor. None of them understood that they were watching the handing over of a key, that the intimacy of the SOP and the urgency of the command were, together, the final instruction in a transaction that had begun long before Judas ever walked into the chamber of hewn stone. Judas rose. He walked out into a night that John's Gospel describes with devastating economy in a single word: night. The Garden of Gethsemane occupied a slope on the western face of the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the eastern wall of the temple. Its ancient olive trees, some of whose root systems may date to the 1st century, grew in the kind of silver-gray darkness that the full Passover moon produces, bright enough to cast shadows, dark enough to hide in them. Judas led a company. The Greek text of John's Gospel is carefully precise about its composition. A speira, a detachment of Roman soldiers, alongside officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, carrying lanterns and torches and weapons. A speira, in military terminology, could refer to anything from a cohort of 600 men to a smaller tactical unit. Whatever the number, it was enough. The Antonia fortress had lent its cooperation to the temple police, and the collaboration of Roman authority with Jewish religious law was tonight, in this garden, wearing the same face. They moved between the trees like a line of low fire. The identification required a gesture that was, in retrospect, almost unbearably intimate. In the dim and mobile light of torches, among a group of bearded Jewish men in similar robes, a visual identification alone was insufficient for legal purposes. A formal greeting, a kiss, the customary welcome between a student and his rabbi, would serve as the unambiguous signal. It would be witnessed. It would be legally defensible. And it would be performed not by a stranger, but by someone the guards could trust to know the right man. Judas had thought about this. He had built the architecture of the reasoning carefully, brick by brick, over days and weeks. He was not betraying. He was fulfilling. He was not destroying. He was liberating. From the body, from the limitation, from the material trap that the Gnostic teachers whispered about in the margins of the movement. The idea that the physical world itself was a kind of prison, and that the divine light trapped inside it was waiting to be released. He walked toward Jesus. He kissed him. And Jesus looked at him with an expression that contained no surprise, no accusation, no recoil. Just recognition. Just the steady, bottomless gaze of a man who had seen this moment from further away than Judas could imagine. "Friend," Jesus said, one word. In Aramaic, heteros, not the deep word for a beloved companion, but the more formal word for an associate, an acknowledged one, a man whose face is known. It was the most devastating word Judas had ever heard. not because it was angry, not because it was wounded, but because it was accurate. And it named something in him that all his theology, all his reasoning, all his careful architecture of justification had been built specifically to avoid naming. They bound Jesus. They led him away through the olive trees toward the lights of the city. Judas did not follow. He remained at the edge of the garden, watching the procession of torchlight move down the slope and across the valley, and somewhere in his chest, the ledger he had kept so carefully for 3 years began, for the first time, to refuse to balance. The trial that followed was illegal by its own tradition's standards. The Mishnah, the codified oral law of the rabbis, was explicit. Capital cases could not be tried at night. Verdicts of execution could not be rendered on the same day as the hearing. Trials were prohibited on feast days or on the eve of a Sabbath. The proceedings in the house of Caiaphas violated virtually every one of these protections simultaneously. But legality, in the hours before dawn on a Passover Friday, had become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a boundary to be respected. Judas watched from the shadows of the courtyard. He saw the witnesses, some of whom gave contradictory testimony even by the prosecution's own accounting. He saw the high priest stand and tear his robes in the theatrical gesture of outrage that the law prescribed. He saw the word formed on the lips of the council before it was spoken aloud. Guilty. And he saw the first blow land. It was at that moment, not in the garden, not at the counting of the coins, not even in the quiet horror of the SOP, that something fundamental collapsed in Judas Iscariot. The Sanhedrin was not interested in a theological resolution. They were not interested in exposing a false prophet or redirecting a misguided movement. They wanted a body. They wanted blood. And the machinery he had set in motion was now moving entirely on its own. And it was moving towards something that no amount of Gnostic reasoning, no theory of cosmic liberation, no philosophy of necessary darkness could adequately contain. He had handed them a man. He had not handed them the right to become what they were becoming. The silver coins in his pouch felt suddenly like something that had changed its nature entirely, like water that had become ice without warning. He pressed his hands against them through the fabric of his robe, and he could not tell in that moment if he was trying to hold them or trying to stop them from burning through. The Greek language, precise in its cruelties, gives us 2 different words for what a man feels when he has done something wrong. The first is metanoia, a deep turning, a transformation of the mind, a genuine reversal of direction that the New Testament associates with salvation. The second is metamelomai, something older, rawer, more physiological. Not a change of heart so much as a revolt of the gut, a regret so complete it becomes physical, like a fever that cannot be sweated out. Matthew's Gospel uses the second word for Judas. He did not repent, he convulsed. When the death sentence was formalized, when the word of condemnation passed through the legal machinery and became irreversible, Judas felt it in his body before he processed it in his mind. The throat tightens, the hands go cold. The world, which had moments ago seemed to operate according to a logic he had carefully constructed and believed in, suddenly reveals itself to be running on a different mechanism entirely. One he does not recognize and cannot control. He ran through the pre-dawn streets of Jerusalem, past the early risers and the merchants setting up their stalls, past the pilgrims still half asleep in their doorways, through the labyrinthine geometry of a city that had, overnight, become a foreign country. He ran the way a man runs when the thing he is fleeing is not behind him, but inside him. He ran back to the temple, The priests were there. Of course they were. It was the morning of the preparation day, the most sacred hours of the most sacred week of the Jewish year. They stood in their robes with the particular composure of men who have accomplished what they set out to accomplish and are now prepared to move on to the next item of business. Judas stood before them with the 30 pieces of silver in his outstretched hands. His voice, when it came, was stripped of everything except the bare, terrible fact: I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood. The priests looked at him with the expression of men confronted by a problem they have already categorized and dismissed. Their response was almost elegant in its coldness. What is that to us? See thou to it. 4 words that constitute perhaps the most complete moral abdication in recorded history. Not our concern. Handle it yourself. The transaction is complete. We are done with you. But there was also a legal dimension to their refusal that went beyond contempt. The Corban laws governed the use of money once it had been dedicated to a sacred purpose. Money used in the service of the temple, even money used to remove what the priests had determined was a threat to the temple's integrity, could not be simply returned to the general fund. It had been handled in the context of a holy transaction. Its contamination was specific, technical, and by the letter of the law they claimed to serve, irreversible. They had used the law to trap a man. Now they were using it to release themselves from any further obligation to him. Judas stared at the coins in his hands for a moment that lasted, in his experience of it, much longer than a moment. Then he did the only thing left to do. He threw them into the holy place itself, the inner precincts of the temple, beyond the court of the Gentiles, beyond the court of women, into the sacred space where ordinary men were not permitted to go. The silver coins scattered across the stone floor with a sound like a sentence being finished. The ringing hung in the air. The priests turned away, and Judas was already gone. The streets of Jerusalem on the morning of Good Friday were not quiet. The city was in the particular kind of motion that precedes a public execution, not festive exactly, but charged, the way air charges before lightning. People moved with purpose and with the sideways awareness of those who know something significant is happening nearby, but have not yet decided what position to take in relation to it. Judas moved through all of it without seeing any of it. What happens to a human mind when the architecture of meaning it has constructed over years suddenly proves uninhabitable? The psychological literature on acute moral trauma developed largely in the 20th century from the experiences of soldiers, survivors, and perpetrators describes a specific constellation of symptoms. The sensory world becomes simultaneously too sharp and too distant. Sounds arrive with unusual force. The throat constricts, as though the body itself is trying to prevent speech. Time loses its normal texture, stretching in some moments and compressing in others until the ordinary sequence of experience becomes untrustworthy. Judas was experiencing all of this. He was also, according to the oldest tradition, beginning to hear things. Whether we call them guilt or spirits, or the simple mechanical consequence of a mind that has pushed past its own load-bearing capacity, something in the air around him had begun to speak in a register that no one else on those streets could hear. He found himself at the southern edge of the city, where the ground fell away sharply into the valley of Hinnom. The Hebrews called it Gehinnom, the source of the word Gehenna, which the Gospels use as a synonym for hell itself. It was, historically, a place where the city's refuse was burned, where in darker centuries the worst kinds of sacrifice had been performed. It was a place that memory had stained. He stood at the edge and looked down, and the distance between where he was standing and where he needed to be seemed, in that moment, very small. The tree was solitary, which is fitting for a man who had spent 3 years surrounded by people and had, for all that time, been fundamentally alone. It stood on a rocky promontory. the kind of sparse, stubborn vegetation that grows in Judean limestone because it has no other choice. The tree known, by a tradition both botanical and bitter, as the Cercis siliquastrum, the Judas tree, blooms in early spring with flowers of an almost violent pink-purple, flowers that emerge directly from the bark rather than from new growth, as though the color is being forced out from inside the wood rather than generated naturally. It was a tree whose beauty, when it came, looked something like a wound. He made his preparations with the methodical attention of a man who had spent 3 years managing logistics. He understood knots. He understood weight and tension and the properties of rope under stress. There is a theology that Judas may have carried in those final minutes, the idea, preserved in fragments of Gnostic tradition, that his own death was not a termination, but a completion. That just as the teacher's body needed to be broken to release the divine light within, so too his own material self needed to be shed like a garment that had served its purpose and could now be laid down. That he and the one he had delivered were, in some cosmic arithmetic, a matched pair of sacrifices, the one incomplete without the other. Whether this was genuine conviction or the desperate reframing of a mind that could not survive without meaning, we cannot say with certainty. We can only say that the branch held long enough and then it didn't. There are 2 accounts of how Judas died, and the Church has wrestled with their apparent contradiction for 2,000 years. Matthew says he hanged himself. The Acts of the Apostles, written by Luke, describes him falling headlong in a field, his body bursting open, his entrails spilling out. Scholars have proposed various reconciliations, that the rope or branch gave way, that the body fell after death, that decomposition accomplished what the fall began. The details resist harmonization because they were recorded from different distances and for different purposes. What is not disputed is the place. Akeldama, the field of blood. The 30 silver coins that Judas had flung across the floor of the temple could not, under the Corban laws, be returned to the treasury. So the priests, performing with exquisite irony the very act of charity toward the poor that Judas had invoked when he rebuked Mary of Bethany, used the money to purchase a field outside the city. A potter's field, where clay had been excavated from the earth, leaving behind a landscape of pits and uneven ground. A place that no one wanted for anything except burying people that no one wanted to bury, in the respectable cemeteries inside the walls. Foreigners, strangers, the unnamed and the unclaimed. The money that had purchased a life now purchased the ground to bury those whom life had discarded. Zechariah had written about it. Jeremiah had written about it. The purchase of a potter's field, the scattering of the 30 pieces. The prophecy had been there, waiting in the text for centuries, like a lock waiting for its key. The upper room felt, in the days that followed, like a place where the air itself had not recovered. 11 men behind locked doors, processing a sequence of events that had moved so fast and cut so deep that none of them had yet found the bottom of the wound. They had lost a teacher, they had lost a friend, and they had discovered that one of their number, someone who had eaten with them, traveled with them, prayed with them, counted their money and managed their provisions, had been, in some capacity they still did not fully understand, the mechanism of that loss. The question of what to do about the empty chair was both practical and theological. The structure of the 12 was not arbitrary, it was symbolic, mirroring the 12 tribes of Israel, announcing in its very shape the nature of what Jesus had come to reconstitute. 11 was an incomplete number, a broken pattern. The selection of Matthias to fill the vacancy was conducted with careful, procedural deliberateness. The qualification was specific. The replacement must have been present from the beginning, from the baptism of John through to the resurrection appearances. He must have been a witness, a specific Greek word, martes, whose meaning would, in the decades ahead, acquire a new and terrible weight. Two names were put forward. Lots were cast. Matthias was chosen. His name appears in the New Testament exactly once, in that moment of selection, and never again. He stepped into the vacancy and was absorbed by history. The number was restored. The broken symmetry was repaired. But the shadow of the 13th chair remained. Not because the chair existed, but because the question it posed refused to be filled by Matthias or by anyone else. The question of what Judas had actually been, what his role had actually meant, whether his name deserved to be struck from the record with finality, or whether it belonged to a story whose full meaning had not yet been reached. That question stayed in the room long after the doors were unlocked and the disciples moved back into the world. It is still in the room. It has never left. The potter's field exists before Judas. That is the detail that should stop us in our tracks and hold us there until we fully reckon with what it means. Zechariah wrote it. Jeremiah pointed toward it. The 30 pieces of silver, the potter, the field, the pieces of the prophecy were scattered across centuries of Jewish scripture like fragments of a map, waiting for the moment when someone would travel the route they described and prove, in the traveling, that the map was real. The uncomfortable question that Orthodox theology has always known it must answer, and has answered in various ways with varying degrees of satisfaction, is this. If the destination was written before the journey began, what exactly was Judas choosing? The potter's field itself was a specific kind of landscape. Clay extraction left the earth in a state of ruin, pits, unstable ground, soil that had been hollowed out and left without the structural integrity of undisturbed land. It was useless for agriculture. It was, in the ancient imagination, a place that had been used up. And it was believed in the folk tradition of first-century Jerusalem that the particular mineral composition of its soil could decompose a human body within 24 hours. A field that consumed the dead as efficiently as fire. A field that left nothing behind. If Judas was the hand of God, if the divine script required a betrayer and the betrayer was selected rather than self-appointed, then the field is not a punishment. It is a receipt, evidence that the transaction completed as specified, that the prophecy was honored, that the machinery of salvation, whatever we believe that machinery to be, ran precisely on schedule. But if that is true, then Judas stands not at the bottom of the moral universe, but at its very center, doing the work that no one else could do, or would do, or was asked to do. Is that heroism? Is it damnation? Can it be both simultaneously? Dante placed him at the very bottom. The 9th circle of hell in the Inferno is not fire. It is ice. And this is the detail that reveals the full architecture of the medieval moral imagination. The worst sins are not the hot ones, the passionate ones, the sins of the body. The worst sin is the calculated betrayal of a bond of love and trust. And at the absolute center of that frozen lake, in the mouth of Lucifer himself, Dante placed 3 figures, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas Iscariot, eternally chewed, eternally conscious, eternally unable to die from what was killing them. The iconography that accumulated around Judas across the medieval centuries was systematic and deliberate. The yellow cloak, yellow being the color assigned to envy, to Jews, to those marked for exclusion in the visual grammar of European Christianity. The red hair, the hooked posture, the bag of coins clutched in one hand. Art did to Judas what art always does to the figures a culture needs to keep at a safe moral distance. It made him recognizable from across the room. It made him other. It made the question of whether any of us might, under different circumstances, make similar choices, completely unnecessary to ask. Then, in the sands of Egypt, something was found. The Codex Chakos surfaced in the antiquities market in the 1970s, passed through several hands, suffered significant damage from improper storage, and eventually came to rest with scholars capable of understanding what it was. Carbon dating placed its physical composition in the 3rd or 4th century. The text it contained was older, much older. Here was a Coptic translation of a Greek original, a gospel that Irenaeus of Lyon had condemned as heretical in the 2nd century. A text he specifically named and specifically warned the faithful to reject. The Gospel of Judas. The translation work was painstaking. Coptic dialects from this period require a particular kind of scholarly intimacy, not just linguistic knowledge, but familiarity with the theological vocabulary of Gnostic communities that had been systematically suppressed and whose texts had survived only in fragments and in the polemics of their opponents. What emerged slowly across years of careful reconstruction was a document that reframed every assumption the Western tradition had built around the name of Judas Iscariot. In this gospel, Jesus does not call Judas a devil. He pulls him aside from the other disciples, those 11 whom the text regards as fundamentally incapable of true understanding, and speaks to him alone. He tells him that he will be cursed by the other generations. He tells him that he will be separated from them, and then he says something that has been ringing in the halls of New Testament scholarship ever since the translation was published in 2006. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me, not betray, sacrifice. The distinction is the entire argument. The psychological portrait of Judas that emerges from 2,000 years of scholarship, art, condemnation, and rehabilitation is not the portrait of a simple man. The greed hypothesis, the 30 coins as evidence of pure mercenary motivation, collapses almost immediately under examination. 30 pieces of silver was not a fortune. It was not enough to retire on, not enough to change a life, barely enough to change a season. A man of Judas's financial literacy, managing the resources of a movement that attracted wealthy patrons, could have stolen far more easily over 3 years if money had been his primary orientation. The disillusionment hypothesis is more interesting. A Judean nationalist who had hoped the Galilean rabbi would become the military liberator that history demanded, and who, watching the triumphal entry devolve into a temple cleansing and a series of parables, decided to force the moment, to trigger the confrontation that Jesus seemed unwilling to initiate himself, to make the revolution happen by removing the option of retreat. The bystander effect in the Garden of Gethsemane is, in this reading, simply the behavior of men who had been promised a kingdom and were still in the dark among the olive trees, waiting for it to arrive in the form they expected. Peter swung a sword. One sword in the wrong direction, cutting off a servant's ear. 11 men who had been told they would sit on 12 thrones, and when the moment of crisis arrived, they scattered into the darkness. Only Judas had acted. Whatever we think of the action, only Judas had done something. Akeldama today is a narrow terrace on the southern slope of the valley where the Kidron and Hinnom converge, below the walls of the old city, in the shadow of the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. Onufrius. The monastery was built in part over ancient tombs, burial chambers cut into the rock face, some of which date to the Second Temple period. The soil here is indeed unusual. Reddish, mineral-heavy, clay-dense. Whether this is the precise field purchased with 30 pieces of silver is not something archaeology can confirm with certainty. But the tradition that located the purchase here is ancient, and the landscape carries the weight of it. It is very quiet at Akeldama. The tourists who move through the old city rarely descend this far. The valley below absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. You can stand at the edge of the terrace and look up at the walls of Jerusalem and understand, perhaps better than anywhere else in the city, what it means to be just outside, close enough to see everything, far enough to be forgotten. Does Judas wander here? The traditions that have accumulated around this place suggest a presence that refuses to fully depart. Not a ghost exactly, but a question. The question of a man who occupies the most contested position in the history of human moral reckoning, simultaneously the instrument of salvation and its cost. The theological concept of apokatastasis, universal restoration, the eventual reconciliation of all things to God, including the damned, has a long and complicated history in Christian thought. Origen proposed it in the 3rd century and was eventually condemned for it. But the idea persists, re-emerging in each generation with the stubbornness of something that refuses to be fully extinguished because it addresses a need that the simpler architecture of heaven and hell cannot quite satisfy. The need to believe that the story ends not in permanent division, but in a homecoming so complete that even the most catastrophic departures are finally gathered back in. If apokatastasis is true, then somewhere in the eternal reckoning, there is a moment when Judas Iscariot stands before the one he kissed in a garden and the ledger is opened for the final audit. Every coin counted, every mile of the 3-year journey accounted for. Every night of calculation, every moment of fracture, every step between the upper room and the pottery field, weighed against whatever it was he understood himself to be doing when he understood himself best. The 30 silver coins melt. The cross is raised against a darkening sky, and the face of Judas, that face that artists across 20 centuries have tried to capture and have always in some essential way missed, fades not into darkness, but into the particular quality of light that comes just before dawn, when the stars are still visible, but the sky has already begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. The documentary ends here, but the question it has been carrying since the first moment does not end. It simply turns and faces you directly. If you were the one chosen, not for your virtue, but for your capacity to endure the dark work, if the weight of the world's salvation required not your faith, not your courage, not your love, but your willingness to be remembered as the one who failed it, if the role required you to become, in the eyes of every generation that followed, the name synonymous with betrayal, would you have the courage to say yes?